share later.
Well, we can start in a second. So the participants are joining in. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are here with Team Broadley, who's the founder at Designing Humans, an organization dedicated to professionalizing and strengthening design in Africa. And he's also the executive head of design at Vodacom, South Africa. And he's previously worked as a product designer and the executive design director at multinational banks and huge places. So basically, he's a big deal. So uh, we are here today to learn about not being black enough. Am I saying that right? I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm excited, and everybody's excited to know more about what you mean by that. Okay,
Awesome.
so over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me move these things around. Give me a second. Don't know why I put it there. Let's go in here and move. Alrighty. There we go. Alrighty. Thanks everybody. Thanks for the intro. So yeah, today I'm gonna chat about not black enough to be white, which is a talk that is about probably one of my least favorite topics, which is myself. As the interest suggested, my name's Dean. You can follow me at those Twitter handles, and I also stream things on Twitch to do with design and gaming. I've worked in small startups, large enterprises all around the world. I've had the absolute pleasure to hire and manage hundreds of designers in my career. I've made lots of mistakes through that process, and I've learned lots of things. And one thing that I came to terms with was there's certain parts of the mindset I apply to how I work with teams, lead teams, etc. That was very rooted in how I experienced the world growing up. And that's what we'll talk a little bit about today, and a nice little story on how you can manage your own resilience. So I won't be talking about design tools or any of that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more easy listening, hopefully. So yeah, a brief history of my home. Our previous speaker was also from South Africa, so she's from Cape Town. I am from Cape Town too. I'm currently based in Johannesburg. If you don't know where South Africa is, you just go to Africa and then go down to the south. Very easy. So I grew up in this city. I learned to swim in those oceans, climb those mountains. I went to school there. And you know, it's a very beautiful place, and Service Valley, and lots of people come for that beauty and kind of diversity of experience you can have there. But you know, before that, South Africa was gripped by apartheid and was a very segregated society. Was very engineered that way, and that's kind of the backdrop from which I was obviously forged through my grandparents, my parents, etc. And when you think about it and look a little closely, it wasn't a really easy job, I think, in some ways, to adequately separate out this country because of the breadth of diversity. We have 11 official languages. And so when you're coming up in this country, you can't only know one language. You're bound to be exposed to many. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about is just how that's informed some of how, even today in business and in design, it's affected the way people look at design, the way they're hiring decisions, and also just how we've got a very important problem to solve in our local community. And when I'm talking about design, I'm specifically talking about human-centered design, UX, service design, product design, etc. And so on the surface, when you looked at how the country was divided, we had white Caucasian, Black African, Indian, and then they had the colored category, which is the one that my family would have been fallen into. But when you look a bit closer, one of the interesting things about that category was they were clearly really struggling to set up the system because it's one of the few categories here where they then started making further categories. You had Cape Griqua, Cape Malay, Cape Colored, other colored, which I think they just gave up and then made a kind of bracket there for themselves, and other Asiatic. So cool, they sat with that, figured it out, and they're like, okay, cool, it's all sorted. We can put all these people in place, and then people know their place forever. Well, not quite. Also, the important part here is that once we got democracy, etc., and things were opened up, and those that were oppressed could buy property and go to better schools, etc. By the time I was starting school, there was kind of this notion that the problem solved, and again, not quite. When I was starting school, I arrived in these segregated playgrounds that were still in those very defined racial groups. And one thing that was weird for me, that never made sense to me, is that I didn't belong in any one of those groups, even the ones that I quote unquote should have belonged to. I didn't quite fit. And this was obviously an incredibly painful experience for me because I didn't have a place that I belonged. It was really difficult for me to fit in. And all the way through school, I was really trying to figure out, well, why is this way and why don't I fit? But as I was getting into high school and starting to get into varsity, I very quickly learned that nobody knew where to put me, and they didn't like that. And so it wasn't necessarily an issue with myself, but it was an issue in mindset, in that these categories were so embedded in our society that I didn't have the necessary attributes that go with any one category, and that makes it very difficult to figure out what to do with me, what to call me, what language to speak to me, what religion to assign to me. And that was really interesting for me to figure out and kind of go, okay, well, that's an interesting thing, because in some ways, when you're assigning yourself that group identity in a very kind of black and white sense, you find that you're then also limiting yourself from a holistic human experience. And then further in your work, you limit yourself around giving yourself permission to be engaging with a holistic human experience. And so then what I figured out was that, hold on, I may not be in any one of these circles or these groups, but I can move between them. And that became my power and my kind of how I even applied my thinking when I started doing design, is that I could gain empathy from these different groups and actually understand all these different sides of the story. And it also meant I could borrow all the different attributes I felt. There was no limits to what I could do, what I could study, or what I could kind of achieve in my career. So I learned basically that belonging maybe meant that I had access everywhere. And as I started then going into the my professional part of my career and looking at teams and seeing these things still popping up and being this program because we're trying to get more Black Africans or etc. Because they were trying to do a good thing. They were trying to correct a past mistake, but they were using quite a binary mindset and, to excuse the pun, quite a black and white mindset. And that was obviously also frustrating, but I introspected and kind of kept working with it. And when I looked at my teams and started looking at how do I make my teams stronger working in large companies, I came across the concept of ecotones, which is an ecological thing where two environments meet. At that point where they meet, you get this edge effect where new species are created. And those species are generally more biodiverse, they're more resilient. And this, for me, also then applied to teams. And if I could bring different skills that don't necessarily make sense and put them into my teams, I could really start to figure out how to make teams more interesting, make more interesting products and more contextually relevant products and services. And also to this point, because of my past and how I was treated, I also had a heightened sensitivity to where these gaps might be with individuals or in the teams again. And so basically being excluded through my early parts of my schooling and design career really helped me to think more inclusively, because I know what that feels like. I know also the value that can be lost by that kind of unconscious exclusion. And as I started kind of getting to higher parts of my career and starting to look after broader teams in multiple countries, I was pushed by some HR teams, etc., to look at this problem, which is something that I already knew existed, but we didn't really understand necessarily. So the data part of me then started looking at it, and I thought, okay, well, this is the country that I live in, right? That's the breakdown in terms of race, etc. But when I looked at my particular industry, especially in enterprise, etc., and at my level, the industry looked a bit more like this. And that's me there in the bottom right-hand corner, just chilling out. And it really was an interesting one. I started chatting to a lot of people who were doing hiring, peers of mine, people that were struggling to find people of color into these roles. And a lot of the time, people would say, well, I just can't find them, these people of color. And I said to them, well, you can't expect to pick a fruit from a tree that you've never planted. And I think that's largely one of the issues that we face when we're trying to tackle some of these problems, is we're looking for something that we may be at the very start of, and we've got to maybe just dig the hole for the seed to be planted, and later the fruit will grow. And part of this is a cognitive bias, which is availability bias, which is basically you trying to find what is closest. And so what is available, you buy, you take as advice, etc. And so, but what the issue with that is, if you keep doing that, you do perpetuate that cycle. And so then you end up with the scaled issue. And when you're looking at this picture, what we're basically doing, if you compare this view to this view, it's kind of like we're catching freshwater fish, but in the ocean. And that for me also didn't make any economic sense, because surely then we were limiting the breadth of pipeline that we could be having in our industry, because we're just taking what's there already. And so by then promoting and sponsoring people into different careers, graduate programs, you start to create the opportunity for people to see people that they feel represent themselves. And when those people start doing well, even though it might be a small few in the beginning, when you see those people thriving, those coming up can then know that that's a possibility for themselves. And one of those things, again, back to the availability bias, is when we're building teams or we're trying to figure out what to do with our work, something I always say is that you've got to really try and care less about being certain and more about being effective. And part of the approach needs to be, when I say starting at level 1 with everybody you meet, so that you don't try and assign some form of group identity to that person at face value. Maybe they didn't study what you studied. Maybe they have an iOS preference to an Android preference. These kind of identities, and we attribute all these other meta informations to those identities, is quite hurtful to you who's trying to build a team or get the most value out of the people around you. And so whether they're a level 1 intern or a level 100 unicorn, you've got to start at level 1 with those people so that you can kind of get the whole human value out of them. And going back to the point of figuring out what part of the role you play and when you will see value out of things, sometimes the problems that we need to solve in our design careers, even the products we're building at that kind of level, not just on teams, sometimes the value we're providing won't necessarily be seen until we've moved on to something else. And so some of the work you do is to lay the groundwork for others to benefit. And one of my favorite quotes about that is to say that society grows great when old people plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. And this is a really important thing for me, because a lot of the work I was doing in the early parts of my career was hard, because you want the result, you want to see the change. But that change, if it's a multi-generational problem, will not necessarily be solved overnight. And that really makes it really difficult. And I've also seen this kind of in people when mentoring them in their careers, is that the people, we want to see this like change now. We want to be better now. We want to be promoted now. And often what we miss there is that we ignore all the signals that our body, our mind, and our environment is giving us, that is telling us that change is coming. But we think that that's actually wrong rather than part of the growth. And so the analogy I'm going to leave you with today is really around, you shouldn't try and be a pot plant, you should be a crab. I mean, that's perfectly logical, right? Those things go well together. Let me explain. If you look at a pot plant, it sits in a pot and it needs somebody else to put it in the right place with the right nutrients, the right sunlight, the right watering, etc., for it to survive. And so it's wholly dependent on external criteria for it to really be as strong as it could be. And how I came about this was also chatting to a lot of juniors or mid-level designers who were moving from one job to another. And I always ask, well, why did you move from one place to the other place? And quite often the response being, well, that place didn't grow me. And my response to them was, well, you're not a pot plant, right? And so if you look deeper, if you take a pot plant out of its pot, it still forms and is stuck in the shape that of the pot it was in. And so those external constraints define its total potential. And we have the ability as people to not be limited by those external constraints. We can look further. And that's where the crab comes in. And we may think, if you look at a crab, it's similar to, it's in a shell. It can't get bigger than that. It's this very defensive, hard, protected thing. But the thing that's really interesting about crabs throughout their life cycle is that for them to get bigger and stronger and better crabs, they have to shed that shell that protects them. And the way they know they need to shed that shell is they get really uncomfortable. They fall and they grow into the edges of the shell, and that is a signal that growth is happening. Whereas people, we tend to shrink to fit the shell we're in. And then we wonder why we're not moving forward potentially in our lives and in our careers. And the crab has to make itself incredibly vulnerable in order to do that. It's literally getting rid of the thing that protects it. But from a strategy point of view, once it's done that, it can now be bigger. And the most important part about it is that no matter how old the crab is, no matter if it's a massive, strong crab, the only way it can get bigger and stronger is by shedding the thing that protects it. And one of the other strategies that crabs employ is that they come together when this is happening. And so they create an environment that is safer to go through this change. And when you're in your team or you're trying to pick out growth as a team or as an individual, just getting sensitive to what's going on with individuals around you is really helpful so that you can help create the environment for the people around you that are going through that change, because that discomfort isn't fun, and we're trained largely to avoid it because discomfort is a bad thing. Whereas with other parts of our lives, we understand that discomfort is a good thing because it means growth. And you can think of fitness as a potential thing there, where when you're unfit and you try to exercise, it's very uncomfortable, but you know that if you push through that, you get more fit. And the same is true of your career, is that big changes that we need to go through to be better as teams or as individuals can most 90% of the time only come through that discomfort, that tension. And part of the reason we do this as humans and why we don't like the discomfort is a cognitive bias, which is called the end of history illusion, which basically, to use tech terms, means that we all think we're YouTube videos and we're done buffering. So no matter what age we are, we all understand that we are the people we are today because of our past experience. However, we vastly underestimate how much our future experience will change us. And one of the other ways I do this is when I'm helping people in their careers is often people think that they are already the CEO or the head of design just without the money. But what they don't necessarily realize is that the head of design or the CEO version of themselves is a different person than who they are today. And so we avoid those changes that might be happening to our personalities or ourselves that makes us more fit for purpose for that future state to keep ourselves the same, because we think we've learned everything we need to have learned by now, and so we're done learning. And so, in short, pot plants need others to define them, whereas crabs go through immense discomfort to define themselves. And I hope that during your day or during your jobs, you look at these things and think about the things that keep you uncomfortable and maybe work with it or work through it with somebody, or just understand that that might be growth happening and that confusion or that frustration might be a good thing at the end of it. And I hope that's been valuable for you. I thank you. Feel free to reach out and ask your questions. And that's me. 1 minute to spare. I think I saved some time for questions. Aha.
Yeah. I think you saved quite a bit of time for questions.
Awesome.
Yep.
I like questions.
Yes.
Stop sharing the screen. Where did the thing go? It's up here, right?
Yeah, it's at the top. So we have one question from our audience. I don't have a name here, but they're asking, how do you manage the conflicts between the two environments, being at the edge in the middle?
That's an interesting question. Conflict is maybe a strong word. It's not letting me unshare. This is so weird. But I would say less conflict and more tension. So tension is going to be a very kind of standard thing that will happen. And it's that fitness thing I was talking about, where you're taking something that doesn't necessarily logically go with something else. And so that tension, that friction is going to be normal. And that's kind of part of the discomfort I was talking about earlier, is that's you and the team kind of figuring out, well, how does this work? And so if you can sit in that discomfort and pay attention and listen more than you talk internally in your mind, you will probably find why things don't make sense. And in that confusion and in working through that, you find the value in those two things coming together. Because none of those new things come through just easy, right? It's not like you just mix two things and then cool, we've got a new drink to drink. It does come through a bit of things. So you've got to be willing to go through that as a team. I think listening more than and asking questions more than telling people. I I think is a really important thing. And often that's the thing I'll do. Even if somebody's in business or whatever, really trying to, let's say, be verbally aggressive, whatever, my approach would generally be, okay, well, they have a point of view that they believe very deeply in, as do I. And so those two environments. And I've got to find a way to bring those things together by asking, okay, but why is that so important to that person? Why is what I'm suggesting so potentially dangerous to them? And then work back from there and go, well, maybe my assumption's wrong, or maybe it isn't. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Do we have any more questions from anybody else in the audience? A couple of people in the chat. Okay. Rasagi asks, do you recommend some books, articles, videos to embrace and act upon your analogy of growing as a designer?
Yeah. So there are a couple probably that are worthwhile. I think somebody mentioned Crucial Conversations earlier. That's a pretty good book for managing your internal narrative. And so that internal narrative is really important for as you're progressing through your career. Often we don't know why we're not progressing, and we think it's, again, an external constraint. And so you've got to be able to manage that internal narrative that way. There's a really good book which talks about lying, which is called On Bullshit, basically. It's a very small book and very short, but it's great. It really helps you understand the difference between dishonesty and where somebody may be saying something that is incorrect, but because they believe it to be true, it's not necessarily that they're lying, right? And then there's a really good book by Krishnamurti, a philosophy book called The Impossible Question, which also is a great kind of way to think about just things that you don't have answers to, or how to think about things that are unknown. I find those really good, those three. Yeah.
Okay, those are fantastic reads. And we got one more question. So Rodrigo asks, what strategies do you use to help a design team close the racial gap?
That's a good question too. So one, to one of the earlier points, something I definitely subscribe to is you just got to start. I don't think that there's a silver bullet, and one of the reasons I don't think there's a silver bullet is because there are no werewolves, and that's what silver bullets are for. And so you've got to just start small and start intentional and authentic. I think also that you've got to really care about the outcome, regardless of what you think it makes you look like, and then engage in very kind of measured dialogue around these things, because it's an uncomfortable problem for a lot of people. But I think for people on all sides, because it's been marred with a lot of violence and segregation, all these kind of very emotional components. And those have resulted in functional and structural impacts to our industry. And I think so one of the strategies I apply is like, one, just start. Two, give more to the communities that you're trying to bring into your industry than you take. So I think that's also really important to the earlier point around planting trees that you can pick fruit from later. That's one of the things. And then don't use time as a metric is a very important one for me. So I don't try and say, well, I'm going to fix this problem in 5 years. I prefer to kind of do measured incremental steps and then see how we're doing and then pivot, etc. And then, because that's actually how the problem came about. So lots of years of a specific mindset and specific structures. And now we've got to kind of do that too. I don't think there's a lever you can pull that's just going to fix that. So yeah, I hope that helps.
That's actually quite a designer approach to this life as well, where we try things and we keep building on top of whatever we get.
Yeah, and then not kind of being too upset when things don't work, right? Because the intent is to fix the problem. At least you took a step forward. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the empathy and driving towards the right direction that matters. Madhurya asks, what are the recent steps to bring more attention to diversity and inclusion that are helping right now?
I think the conversations are happening a lot more regularly now than they were, let's say, 10 years ago, you know. So that's one of the things that's really helping. I think more people are open to having that discussion without having their defenses up as much as before. I do think one of the problems is that we need to navigate is we, as human beings, we tend to wait for things to be on fire before we want to solve them. And so some of the things we see in the various communities around the world is those are the fires going off. And I think some of the steps that I'm starting to see is that we're focusing on root cause, some of the things that are not so in your face, because those fires are created by those things. And so we get into, again, hiring practices, language, how we kind of talk to one another and work with one another, how we kind of take self-awareness into account into, some things are not my story to tell. And I think those things, the more we can do those and focus on solving the things that are, the feeders to these things that eventually become big gods, I think a good, probably a more sustainable way to solve the problem than just waiting for a big thing to happen. The big things are helpful because, again, our brains are built for those explosive catalyst events. So we jump and we're very good when a building falls over or something like as humans. But we're not great with slow release things like global warming and the environment, etc. And this is one of those things too, where we can't see, and I said this about COVID too, I think if the virus lit you on fire when you got it, we probably solved the problem by now. But because it's something that you can't feel unless it's close to you, it's a similar thing. And I think that creating that empathy where people can start to understand what it's like, etc., from different sides of the story, I think is probably something to aim for.
Yes, I think that makes quite a lot of sense.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, Dean. Thank you for your time. There was an amazing presentation and even awesome answers to the questions. And
thank you, everybody. Great job at the conference. You guys are hitting it out of the park.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot with all of your support. So the next session would be an Adaptlist ADP list mentorship session. So who has signed up and gotten emails for it, please go ahead and join in. You need some registers, so please go ahead and finish that. We'll be starting there shortly. We'll be back here for the next talk in 30 minutes. Thank you. All right.
Awesome. Peace.
Bye-bye. Peace.